Today I'm going to read from an essay of Dr. Jung's from volume 16 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. And this is it, the practice of psychotherapy. Essays on the psychology of the transference and other subjects, translated by R.F.C. Hall. This is volume 16 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. And the reading, which I think I'll have to cut into two parts, deals with 4 stages of development, not only of our psychology, of ourselves, but probably of our societies as well. So I'll just mention them. The first stage in terms of psychotherapy is catharsis. This is where we admit our sins. We either do that to a priest or to a psychotherapist, and that helps us at least know everything about what our sins are. The next stage is elucidation, where a psychotherapist would assist you in amplifying where this came from. The third stage is education, which helps us understand that all human beings are very much like that in some ways, and trying to fit one's own ideas into what is reasonable. And the fourth stage is transformation. We're all living history. We're living history in the United States right now in our current events, and our country will be different after these events occur. And so we're all having to think about this transformation. But I think this article applies to all of us, and it's helpful to all of us to understand it. And so I'm going to read it. It was first published in 1929, and in London and New York, translated by C.F. Baines and W.S. Dell as part of Modern Man in Search of a Soul, London and New York, 1933. Problems of modern psychotherapy. Psychotherapy, or the treatment of the mind by psychological methods, is today identified in popular thought with psychoanalysis. The word psychoanalysis, does my sound good? I assume, okay. Looks like it's okay. All right. The word psychoanalysis has become so much a part of common speech that everyone who uses it seems to understand what it means. But what the word actually connotes is unknown to most laymen. According to the intention of its creator, Freud, it can be appropriately applied only to the method inaugurated by himself of reducing psychic symptoms and complexes to certain repressed impulses. And insofar as this procedure is not possible without the corresponding points of view, the idea of psychoanalysis also includes certain theoretical assumptions formulated as the Freudian theory of sexuality, expressly insisted upon by its author. But Freud notwithstanding, the layman employs the term psychoanalysis loosely for all modern attempts whatsoever to probe the mind by scientific methods. Thus, Adler's school must submit to being labeled psychoanalytic, despite the fact that Adler's viewpoint and method are apparently in irreconcilable opposition to those of Freud. In consequence, Adler does not call his psychology psychoanalysis, but individual psychology. while I prefer to call my own approach analytical psychology, by which I mean something like a general concept embracing both psychoanalysis and individual psychology, as well as other endeavors in the field of complex psychology. Since paragraph 116. Since, however, there is but one mind or one psyche in man, it might seem to the layman that there can be only one psychology, and he might therefore suppose these distinctions to be either subjective quibbles or the commonplace attempts of small-minded persons to set themselves up on little thrones. I could easily lengthen the list of psychologies by mentioning other systems not included under analytical psychology. There are, in fact, many different methods, standpoints, views, and beliefs, which are all at war with one another, chiefly because they all misunderstand one another and refuse to give one another their due. The many-sidedness, the diversity, the psychological opinions in our day is nothing less than astonishing, not to say confusing for the layman. Paragraph 117. If in a textbook of pathology we find numerous remedies of the most diverse kind prescribed for a given disease, we may safely conclude that none of these remedies is particularly efficacious. So, when many different ways of approaching the psyche are recommended, we may rest assured that none of them leads with absolute certainty to the goal, least of all those advocated with fanaticism. The very number of present-day psychologies is a confession of perplexity. The difficulty of gaining access to the psyche is gradually being borne in upon us, and the psyche itself is seen to be a horned problem, to use Nietzsche's expression. It is small wonder, therefore, that efforts to attack this elusive riddle keep on multiplying, first from one side and then from another. The variety of contradictory standpoints and opinions is the inevitable result. The reader will doubtless agree that in speaking of psychoanalysis, we should not confine ourselves to its narrower connotation, but should deal in general with the successes and failures of the various contemporary endeavors, which we sum up under the term analytical psychology, to solve the problem of the psyche. Paragraph 119. But why this sudden interest in the human psyche as a datum of experience? For thousands of years, it was not so. I wish merely to raise this apparently irrelevant question, not to answer it. In reality, it is not irrelevant because the impulses at the back of our present-day interest in psychology have a sort of subterranean connection with this question. All that now passes under the layman's idea of psychoanalysis has its origin in medical practice. Consequently, most of it is medical psychology. This psychology bears the unmistakable stamp of the doctor's consulting room, as can be seen not only in its terminology, but also in its theoretical setup. Everywhere we come across assumptions which the doctor has taken over from a natural science and biology. It is this that has largely contributed to the divorce between modern psychology and the academic or humane sciences, for psychology explains things in terms of irrational nature, whereas the latter studies are grounded in the intellect. The distance between mind and nature, difficult to bridge at best, is still further increased by a medical and biological nomenclature, which often strikes us as thoroughly mechanical and more often than not severely overtaxes the best intentioned understanding. Paragraph 121. Having expressed the hope that the foregoing general remarks may not be out of place in view of the confusion of terms existing in this field, I should now like to turn to the real task in hand and scrutinize the achievements of analytical psychology. Paragraph 122. Since the endeavors of our psychology are so extraordinarily heterogeneous, it is only with the greatest difficulty that we can take up a broadly inclusive standpoint. If, therefore, I try to divide the aims and results of these endeavors into certain classes, or rather stages, I do so with the express reservation appropriate to a purely provisional undertaking, which, it may be objected, is just as arbitrary as the surveyor's triangulation of a landscape. Be that as it may, I would venture to regard the sum total of our findings under the aspect of 4 stages, namely confession, elucidation, education, and transformation. I shall now proceed to discuss these somewhat unusual terms. The first, paragraph 123. The first beginnings of all analytical treatment of the soul are to be found in its prototype, the confessional. Since, however, the two have no direct causal connection, but rather grow from a common irrational psychic root, it is difficult for an outsider to see at once the relation between the groundwork of psychoanalysis and the religious institution of the confessional. Paragraph 124. Once the human mind had succeeded in inventing the idea of sin, man had recourse to psychic concealment, or, in analytical parlance, repression arose. Anything concealed is a secret. The possession of secret acts like a psychic poison that alienates their possessor from, the possession of secrets acts like a psychic poison that alienates their possessor from the community. In small doses, this poison can be an invaluable medicament, even an essential precondition of individual differentiation. So much so that even in the primitive level, man feels an irresistible need actually to invent secrets. Their possession safeguards him from dissolving into the featureless flow of unconscious community life, and thus from deadly peril to his soul. It is a well-known fact that the widespread and very ancient rites of initiation, with their mystery cults, subserved this instinct for differentiation. Even the Christian sacraments were looked upon as mysteries in the early church, and in the case of baptism, were celebrated in secluded spots and only mentioned under the veil of allegory. Paragraph 125. Paragraph 125. A secret shared with several persons is as beneficial as merely private secret is destructive. The latter works like a burden of guilt, cutting off the unfortunate possessor from communion with his fellows. But if we are conscious of what we are concealing, the harm done is decidedly less than if we do not know what we are repressing, or even that we have repressions at all. In this case, the hidden content is no longer consciously kept secret. We are concealing it even from ourselves. It then splits off from the conscious mind as an independent complex and leads a sort of separate existence in the unconscious psyche, where it can be neither interfered with, not corrected by the conscious mind. Where it can be neither interfered with nor corrected by the conscious mind. The complex forms, so to speak, a miniature self-contained psyche, which, as experience shows, develops a peculiar fantasy life of its own. What we call fantasy is simply spontaneous psychic activity, and it wells up wherever the inhibitive actions of the conscious mind abates, or, as in sleep, ceases altogether. In sleep, fantasy takes the form of dreams, but in waking life, too, we continue to dream beneath the threshold of consciousness, especially when under the influence of repressed or unconscious complexes. Incidentally, unconscious contents Incidentally, unconscious contents are on no account composed exclusively of complexes that were once conscious and subsequently became unconscious by being repressed. The unconscious, too, has its the unconscious too sorry, we have a little allergy business going on here. The unconscious, too, has its own specific contents, which push up from the unknown depths and gradually reach consciousness. Hence, we should in no wise picture the unconscious psyche as a mere receptacle of contents discarded by the conscious mind. All unconscious contents which either approach the threshold of consciousness from below or have sunk only slightly beneath it affect the conscious mind. This is paragraph 126 I'm reading from. Since the content does not appear as such in consciousness, these effects are necessarily indirect. Most of our lapses are traceable to such disturbances, as are all neurotic symptoms, which are nearly always, in medical parlance, of a psychogenic nature, the exceptions being shock effects, shell shock, and the like. The mildest forms of neurosis are the lapses of consciousness mentioned above. For example, slips of the tongue, suddenly forgetting names and dates, inadvertent clumsiness leading to injuries and accidents, misunderstandings, and so-called hallucinations of memory, as when we think we have something or done something, or faulty apprehension of things heard and said, and so on. Paragraph 127. In all these instances, a thorough investigation can show the existence of some content which, an indirect and unconscious way, is distorting the performance of the conscious mind. Paragraph 128. Generally speaking, therefore, an unconscious secret is more injurious than a conscious one. I have seen many patients who, as a result of difficult circumstances that might well have driven weaker natures to suicide, sometimes developed a suicidal tendency, but because of their inherent reasonableness, prevented it from becoming conscious, and in this way generated an unconscious suicide complex. This unconscious urge to suicide then engineered all kinds of dangerous accidents, as, for instance, a sudden attack of giddiness on some exposed place, hesitation in front of a motor car, mistaking corrosive sublimate for cough mixture, a sudden zest for dangerous acrobatics, and so forth. When it was possible to make the suicidal leaning conscious in these cases, common sense could intervene as a salutary check. The patients could then consciously recognize and avoid the situations that tempted them to self-destruction. Paragraph 129. All personal secrets, therefore, have the effect of sin or guilt, whether or not they are, from the standpoint of popular morality, wrongful secrets. Paragraph 130. Another form of concealment is the act of holding something back, what we usually hold back are emotions or effects. Here, too, it must be stressed that self-restraint is healthy and beneficial. It may even be a virtue. That is why we find self-discipline to be one of the earliest moral acts, even among primitive peoples, where it has its place in the initiation ceremonies, chiefly in the form of aesthetic continence and the stoical endurance of pain and fear. Self-restraint is here practiced within a secret society as an undertaking shared with others. But if self-restraint is only a personal matter, unconnected with any religious views, it may become as injurious as the personal secret. Hence the well-known bad moods and irritability of the over-virtuous. The effect withheld is likewise something we conceal, something we can hide even from ourselves, an art in which men particularly excel, while women, with very few exceptions, are by nature averse to doing such injury to their effects. When an effect is withheld, it is just as isolating and just as disturbing in its effects as the unconscious secret, and just as guilt-laden. In the same way that nature seems to bear us a grudge if we have the advantage of a secret over the rest of humanity, so she takes it amiss if we withhold our emotions from our fellow men. Nature decidedly abhors a vacuum in this respect. Hence, there is nothing more hence there is nothing more endurable. Hence there is nothing more unendurable in the long run than a tepid harmony based on the withholding of effects. The repressed emotions are often of a kind we wish to keep secret, but more often there is no secret worth mentioning, only emotions which have become unconscious through being withheld at some critical juncture. Paragraph 131. The respective predominance of secrets or of inhibited emotions is probably responsible for the different forms of neurosis. At any rate, the historical subject who is very free with his emotions is generally the possessor of a secret, while the hardened psychasthenic, while the hardened psychasthenic suffers from emotional indigestion. Paragraph 132. To cherish secrets and hold back emotion is a psychic misdemeanor for which nature finally visits us with sickness. That is, when we do things in private. But when they are done in communion with others, they satisfy nature and may even count as useful virtues. It is only restraint practiced for oneself alone that is unwholesome. It is as if man had an inalienable right to withhold all that is dark, imperfect, stupid, and guilty in his fellow man. For such, of course, are the things we keep secret in order to protect ourselves. It seems to be a sin in the eyes of nature to hide our inferiority, just as much as to live entirely on our inferior side. There would appear to be a sort of conscience in mankind which severely punishes everyone who does not somehow and at some time, at whatever cost to his virtuous pride, cease to defend and assert himself, and instead confess himself fallible and human. Until he can do this, an impenetrable wall shuts him off from the vital feeling that he is a man among other men. Paragraph 133. This explains the extraordinary significance of genuine, straightforward confession, a truth that was probably known to all the initiation rites and mystery cults of the ancient world. There is a saying from the Greek mysteries, quote, "Give up what thou hast, and then thou wilt receive, unquote. Paragraph 134. We may well take this saying as a motto for the first stage of psychotherapeutic treatment. The beginnings of psychoanalysis are, in fact, nothing else than the scientific rediscovery of an ancient truth. Even the name that has given to the earliest method, catharsis or cleansing, is a familiar term in the classical rites of initiation. The early cathartic method consisted in putting the patient, with or without the paraphernalia of hypnosis, in touch with the hinterland of his mind, hence into that state which the yoga systems of the East describe as meditation or contemplation. In contrast to yoga, however, the aim here is to observe the sporadic emergence, whether in the form of images or feelings, of those dim representations which detach themselves in the darkness from the invisible realm of the unconscious and move as shadows before the interned gaze. In this way, things repressed and forgotten come back again. This is a gain in itself, though often a painful one, for the inferior and even the worthless belongs to me as my shadow and gives me substance and mass. How can I be substantial without casting a shadow? I must have a dark side too if I am to be whole. And by becoming conscious of my shadow, I remember once more that I am a human being like any other. At any rate, if this rediscovery of my own wholeness remains private, it will only restore the earlier condition from which the neurosis, i.e., the split off complex, sprang. Privacy prolongs my isolation, and the damage is only partially mended. But through confession, I throw myself into the arms of humanity again, freed at last from the burden of moral exile. The goal of the cathartic method is full confession, not merely the intellectual recognition of the facts with the head, but their confirmation by the heart and the actual release of suppressed emotion. Sorry, I'm wearing the wrong spectacles. Paragraph 135. As may easily be imagined, the effect of such a confession on simple souls is very great. Its curative results are often astonishing. Yet I would not wish to see the main achievement of our psychology at this stage merely in the fact that some sufferers are cured, but rather in the systematic emphasis it lays upon the significance of confession. For this concerns us all. All of us are somehow divided by our secrets, but instead of seeking to cross the gulf in the firm bridge of confession, we choose the treacherous makeshift of opinion and illusion. Paragraph 136. Now I am far from wishing to enunciate a general maxim. It would be difficult to imagine anything more unsavory than a wholesale confession of sin. Psychology simply establishes the fact that we are here. Psychology simply establishes the fact that we have here a sore spot of first-rate importance. As the next stage, the stage of elucidation, will make clear, it cannot be tackled directly because it is a problem with quite particularly pointed horns. Paragraph 137. It is, of course, obvious that the new psychology would have remained at the stage of confession had catharsis proved itself a panacea. First and foremost, however, it is not always possible to bring the patient close enough to the unconscious for them to perceive the shadows. On the contrary, many of them, and for the most part, Complicated, highly conscious persons are so firmly anchored in consciousness that nothing can pry them loose. They develop the most violent resistances to any attempt to push consciousness aside. They want to talk with the doctor on the conscious plane and go into a rational explanation and discussion of their difficulties. They have quite enough to confess already, they say. They do not have to turn to the unconscious for that. For such patients, a complete technique for approaching the unconscious is needed. Paragraph 138. This is one fact which at the outset seriously restricts application of the cathartic method. The other restriction reveals itself later on and leads straight into the problems of the second stage. Let us suppose that in a given case, the cathartic confession has occurred, the neurosis has vanished, or rather the symptoms are no longer visible. The patient could now be dismissed as cured if it depended on the doctor alone. But he, or especially she, cannot get away. The patient seems bound to the doctor through the confession. If this seemingly senseless attachment is forcibly severed, there's a bad relapse. Significantly enough, and most curiously, there are cases where no attachment develops. The patient goes away apparently cured, but he is now so fascinated by the hinterland of his own mind that he continues to practice catharsis on himself at the expense of his adaptation to life. He is bound to the unconscious, to himself, and not to the doctor. Clearly, the same fate has befallen him as once befell Theseus and Perithous, his companion, who went down to Hades to bring back the goddess of the underworld. Tiring on the way, they sat down to rest for a while, only to find that they had grown fast to the rocks and could not rise. Thank you for being with me today. Carrying on. I'm reading from Problems of Modern Psychotherapy from The Practice of Psychotherapy, volume 16 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. Paragraph 139. These curious and unforeseen mischances need elucidation just as much as the first mentioned cases, those that proved inaccessible to catharsis. In spite of the fact that the two categories of patients are apparently quite different, elucidation is called for at precisely the same point, that is, where the problem of fixation arises, as was correctly recognized by Freud. This is immediately obvious with patients who have undergone catharsis, especially if they remain bound to the doctor. The same sort of thing had already been observed as the unpleasant result of hypnotic treatment, although the inner mechanisms of such a tie were not understood. It now turns out that the nature of the tie in question corresponds more or less to the relation between father and child. The patient falls into a sort of childish dependence from which he cannot defend himself even by rational insight. The fixation is at times extraordinarily powerful. Its strength is so amazing that one suspects it of being fed by forces quite outside ordinary experience. Since the tie is the result of an unconscious process, the conscious mind of the patient can tell us nothing about it. Hence, the question arises of how this new difficulty is to be met. Obviously, we are dealing with a neurotic formation, a new symptom directly induced by the treatment. The unmistakable outward sign of the situation is that the feeling-toned memory image of the father is transferred to the doctor, so that whether he likes it or not, the doctor appears in the role of father and thus turns the patient into a child. Naturally, the patient's childishness does not arise on that account. It was always present, but repressed. Now it comes to the surface, and the long lost father, being found again, tries to restore the family situation of childhood. Freud gave to this symptom the appropriate name of transference. That there should be a certain dependence on the doctor who has helped you is a perfectly normal and humanly understandable phenomenon. What is abnormal and unexpected is the extraordinary toughness of the tie and its imperviousness to conscious correction. Okay, keeping reading. I have a small drink here. Paragraph 140. It is one of Freud's outstanding achievements to have explained the nature of this tie, or at least the biological aspects of it, and thus to have facilitated an important advance in psychological knowledge. Today, it has been incontestably proved that the tie is caused by unconscious fantasies. These fantasies have in the main what we may call an incestuous character, which seems adequately to explain the fact that they remain unconscious, for we can hardly expect such fantasies barely conscious at best, to come out even in the most scrupulous confession. Although Freud always speaks of incest fantasies as though they were repressed, further experience has shown that in very many cases, they were never the contents of the conscious mind at all, and were conscious only as the vaguest adumbrations, for which reason they could not have been repressed intentionally. It is more probable that the incest fantasies were always essentially unconscious and remained so until positively dragged into the light of day by the analytical method. This is not to say that fishing them out of the unconscious is a reprehensible interference with nature. It is something like a surgical operation on the psyche, but absolutely necessary inasmuch as the incest fantasies are the cause of the transference and its complex symptoms, which are no less abnormal for being an artificial product. Paragraph 141. While the cathartic method restores to the ego such contents as are capable of becoming conscious and should normally be components of the conscious mind, the process of clearing up the transference brings to light contents which are hardly ever capable of becoming conscious in that form. This is the cardinal distinction between the stage of confession and the stage of elucidation. Paragraph 142. We spoke earlier of two categories of patients, those who prove impervious to catharsis and those who develop a fixation after catharsis. We have just dealt with those whose fixation takes the form of transference. But besides these, there are people who, as already mentioned, develop no attachment to the doctor, but rather to their own unconscious, in which they become entangled as in a web. Here, the parental imago is not transferred to any human object, but remains a fantasy, although as such it exerts the same pull and results in the same tie as does the transference. The first category, the people who cannot yield themselves unreservedly to catharsis, can be understood in the light of Freudian research. Even before they came along for treatment, they stood in an identity relationship to their parents, deriving from it that authority, independence, and critical power which enabled them successfully to withstand the catharsis. They are mostly cultivated, differentiated personalities who, unlike the others, did not fall helpless victims to the unconscious activity of the parental imago, but rather usurped this activity by unconsciously identifying themselves with their parents. Faced with the phenomenon of transference, mere confession is of no avail. It was for this reason that Freud was driven to substantial modifications by Breuer's original cathartic method. What he now practiced, he called the interpretive method. Paragraph 144. This further step is quite logical, for the transference relationship is in especial need of elucidation. How very much this is the case, the layman can hardly appreciate, but the doctor who finds himself suddenly entangled in a web of incomprehensible and fantastic notions sees it all too clearly. He must interpret the transference, explain to the patient what he is projecting upon the doctor. Since the patient himself does not know what it is, the doctor is obliged to submit what scraps of fantasy he can obtain from the patient to analytical interpretation. The first and most important products of this kind are dreams. Freud therefore proceeded to examine dreams exclusively for their stock of wishes that had been repressed because incompatible with reality, and in the process discovered the incestuous contents of which I have spoken. Naturally, the investigation revealed not merely incestuous material in the stricter sense of the word, but every conceivable kind of filth of which human nature is capable, and it is notorious that a lifetime would be required to make even a rough inventory of it. Paragraph 145. The result of the Freudian method of elucidation is a minute elaboration of man's shadow side, unexampled in any previous age. It is the most effective antidote imaginable to all the idealistic illusions about the nature of man, and it is therefore no wonder that there arose on all sides the most violent opposition to Freud and his school. I will not speak of the inveterate illusionists. I would merely point out that among the opponents of this method of explanation, there are not a few who have no illusions about man's shadow side, and yet object to the biased portrayal of man from the shadow side alone. After all, the essential thing is not the shadow, but the body which casts it. This is what happens when one tries to read aloud from this material, which addresses the very deep unconscious. It has the effect of actually hypnotizing one, and it hypnotizes me. And so I've been known to fall asleep during a reading only because of that, because Dr. Jung himself is hypnotizing me. Anyway, going on. And so I do these little breaks as a way to break the hypnosis, even for the listener. Reading on. Paragraph 146. Freud's interpretive method rests on reductive explanations which unfailingly lead backwards and downwards, and it is essentially destructive if overdone or handled one-sidedly. Nevertheless, psychology has profited greatly from Freud's pioneer work. It has learned that human nature has its black side, and not man alone, but his works, his institutions, and his convictions as well. Even our purest and holiest beliefs rest on very deep and dark foundations. After all, we can explain a house not only from the attic downwards, but from the basement upwards. And the latter explanation what has the prime advantage of being genetically the more correct, since houses are in fact built bottom side first, and the beginnings of all things is simple and crude. No thinking person can deny that Solomon Reinach's explanation of the Last Supper in terms of primitive totemism is fraught with significance, nor will he reject the application of the incest hypothesis to the myths of the Greek divinities. Certainly, it pains our sensibilities to interpret radiant things from the shadow side, and thus, in a measure, trample them in the sorry dirt of their beginnings. But I hold it to be an imperfection, but I hold it to be an imperfection in things of beauty and of frailty in man, if anything of such a kind permit itself to be destroyed by a mere shadow explanation. The uproar over Freud's interpretations is entirely due to our own barbarous and childish naivete, which does not understand that high rests on low and that les extremes se touchent really is one of the ultimate verities. Our mistake lies in supposing that the radiant things are done away with by being explained from the shadow side. This is a regrettable error into which Freud himself has fallen. Shadow pertains to light as evil to good, and vice versa. Therefore, I cannot lament the shock which this exposure administered to our Occidental illusions and pettiness. On the contrary, I welcome it as an historical and necessary rectification of almost incalculable importance, for it forces us to accept a philosophical relativism such as Einstein's embodies for mathematical physics, and which is fundamentally a truth of the Far East, whose ultimate effects we cannot at present foresee. I have 5 stars next to this paragraph. Paragraph 147. Nothing, it is true, is less effective than an intellectual idea. But when an idea is a psychic fact that crops up in 2 such totally different fields as psychology and physics, apparently without historical connection, then we must give it our closest attention. For ideas of this kind represent forces which are logically and morally unassailable. They are always stronger than man and his brain. He fancies that he makes these ideas, but in reality, they make him, and make him their unwitting mouthpiece. Paragraph 148. To return to our problem of fixation, I should now like to deal with the effects of elucidation. The fixation having been traced back to its dark origins, the patient's position becomes untenable. He cannot avoid seeing how inept and childish his demands are. He will either climb down from his exalted position of despotic authority to a more modest level and accept an insecurity which may prove very, very wholesome, or he will realize the inescapable truth that to make claims on others is a childish self-indulgence which must be replaced by a greater sense of responsibility. Paragraph 149. The man of insight will draw his own moral conclusions. Armed with the knowledge of his deficiencies, he will plunge into the struggle for existence and consume in progressive work and experience all those forces and longings which previously caused him to cling obstinately to a child's paradise, or at least to look back at it over his shoulder. Normal adaptation and forbearance with his own shortcomings, these will be his guiding moral principles, together with freedom from sentimentality and illusion. The inevitable result is a turning away from the unconscious as from a source of weakness and temptation, the field of moral and social defeat. Paragraph 150. The problem which now faces the patient is his education as a social being. And with this, we come to the third stage. For many morally sensitive natures, mere insight into themselves has sufficient motive force to drive them forward, but it is not enough for people with little moral imagination. For themselves to say nothing, for them to say nothing of those who have been struck by the analyst's interpretation, but still doubt in their heart of hearts. Self-knowledge without the spur of external necessity is ineffective even when they are deeply convinced of its truth. Then again, it is just the intellectually differentiated people who grasp the truth of the reductive explanation, but cannot tolerate mere deflation of their hopes and ideals. In these cases, too, the power of insight will be of no avail. The explanatory method always presupposes sensitive natures capable of drawing independent moral conclusions from insight. It is true that elucidation goes further than uninterpreted confession alone, for at least it exercises the mind and may awaken dormant forces which can intervene in a helpful way. But the fact remains that in many cases, the most thorough elucidation leaves the patient an intelligent but still incapable child. Moreover, Freud's cardinal explanatory principle in the terms of pleasure and its satisfaction is, as further research has shown, one-sided and therefore unsatisfactory. Not everybody can be explained from this angle. No doubt we all have this angle, but it is not always the most important. We can give a starving man a beautiful painting. He would much prefer bread. We can nominate a languishing lover president of the United States, but he would far rather wrap his arms around his adored. On the average, all those who have no difficulty in achieving social adaptation and social position are better accounted for by the pleasure principle than are the unadapted who, because of their social inadequacy, have a craving for power and importance. The elder brother, who follows in his father's footsteps and wins to a commanding position in society, may be tormented by his desires, while the younger brother, who feels himself suppressed and overshadowed by the other two, may be goaded by ambition and need for self-assertion. He may yield so completely to this passion that nothing else can become a problem for him. Anyway, not a vital one. Okay, that's where I tentatively thought I would stop today because this article goes on for another 10 pages. And I have my own problems of becoming hypnotized by the ideas and their complexity. So I will conclude the reading for today, and tomorrow, or possibly later today, but probably tomorrow, I will conclude the second half of this essay, which is entitled Problems of Modern Psychotherapy by C.G. Jung, and it comes from The Practice of Psychotherapy, Essays on the Psychology of the Transference and Other Subjects, which is volume 6 of the, volume 16 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. Thank you for joining me today. See you again soon.